Hello, and welcome to tonight's journey. Let your body slow down for a little while. Relax your shoulders. Leave behind every sound of the long day. And imagine that before your eyes is no longer the familiar room around you, but a dark, quiet sea, breathing beneath the Egyptian sky more than 2,000 years ago, far in the distance. While the night has not yet fully faded, a flame appears on the summit of Pharos, the great lighthouse of Alexandria. It does not blaze violently. It simply stands there, tall and silent, like an eye of stone gazing out over the Mediterranean, guiding weary ships toward one of the strangest cities of the ancient world. Tonight, we will not merely step into the library of Alexandria as a symbol covered in the dust of old books. We will explore 24 hours inside that city, around the year 150 BC, when Alexandria was still a place where knowledge, power, trade, and mythology lived together in a single breath. We will pass through the harbor at dawn, through its wide streets, through the palace quarter of the Ptolemaic kings, through the Mouseion, where scholars debated poetry, mathematics, medicine, and the stars. We will listen to the sound of papyrus being unrolled, the voices of the market rising beneath the midday sun, the scent of sea salt, the smell of ink, and the fragrance of incense inside the temple of Serapeum as evening descends. And before we begin, ask yourself this: if you could live one day in ancient Alexandria, where would you want to step first? Into the library, the harbor, the royal palace, or an ancient temple beneath the glow of sunset? Now, as the first light touches the surface of the water, let us step into Alexandria. Before the sun touched the coast of Egypt, the Mediterranean still lay beneath a very deep blue-black shade. The surface of the water was not entirely calm, but neither was it violent. It moved slowly, like an enormous creature breathing in the darkness. On a boat drawing near the shore, every sound became clearer than usual: the creaking of wood, the tightening of ropes, the gentle stroke of oars, the small waves tapping against the side of the vessel after a long night at sea. No one spoke too loudly at this hour. Seafarers understood that before dawn, everything should be held within silence. Then, from the low and misted horizon, a light appeared. At first, it was only a very small point, as though someone had placed a lamp at the edge of the world. But the closer the boat came, the steadier and higher that light became, not flickering like a campfire on the shore, and not low like a lamp inside a house. It stood high above the island of Pharos, looking out over the wide sea, to sailors exhausted after many days adrift. That light was not merely a sign. It was a promise that land was near, that what lay ahead was not an unnamed stretch of rock, but Alexandria, the most renowned harbor city of Ptolemaic Egypt. The lighthouse of Pharos needed no trumpet, no banners, no man standing on the tower to call out from afar. Its silhouette, alone in the darkness, was enough to make every ship feel that it was entering a land of power, built on the island of Pharos. That structure did more than help ships find their way. It told everyone arriving from the sea that the city ahead knew how to master space, how to turn stone, fire, engineering, and ambition into a symbol visible from offshore in the ancient world, where sea voyages always carried danger, fog, storms, and mistakes that could cost lives. Such a guiding flame made Alexandria different from the very first moment. Imagine that you are standing on the deck of a boat around the year 150 BC. The sea wind passes over your cloak, carrying with it the taste of salt and the damp chill of night. Behind you are days of drifting between the lands of the Mediterranean. Ahead of you is a city many people have heard of before ever seeing it, a place with a great harbor. The palaces of the Ptolemaic kings, broad straight streets, storehouses filled with wheat, wine, oil, papyrus, and stories of scholars living near the palace, bending over scrolls brought from distant regions. But in this moment, before stepping into any of those things, Alexandria appears only as light, a flame on high, a shoreline still dim, a silent invitation from the ancient world. The boat slowed as it approached the harbor entrance. No one wanted to rush in such crowded waters. Although the sky was still dark, people could already sense the presence of other vessels. Some were waiting to enter the docks. Some had just dropped anchor overnight. Some had come from the Aegean, from Cyprus, from the coasts of Syria, from other Greek cities, or from the routes that carried distant goods into Egypt. Some carried wine in clay amphorae. Some carried olive oil, timber, metal, fabrics, spices, or small but precious goods wrapped carefully in boxes and baskets. There were also boats carrying goods out from within Egypt, especially wheat, a product whose value was understood across the entire Mediterranean. In Alexandria, the sea was not merely scenery. The sea was the greatest road leading into the city. Every ship that arrived here carried more than cargo. It carried news, languages, voices, rumors, letters, memories, and sometimes even precious texts rolled carefully inside their containers. A merchant might come for profit, an envoy for a political mission, a scholar for the city's reputation, a sailor simply to trade goods and rest. But all of them had to pass through the same gateway. They had to see Pharos first, then enter the harbor, then allow Alexandria to unfold before their eyes like a colossal machine beginning to wake. Today, that city still exists, but it has almost taken on another face. Modern Alexandria, or Alexandria, is no longer the capital of the Ptolemaic kings, no longer a place where groups of scholars crossed palace courtyards with papyrus scrolls in their hands, and the great Pharos has long since vanished from the horizon. Where the fire of the lighthouse once guided ships into the harbor, today people see the Capet Citadel standing at the water's edge, like a stone memory of an age that has sunk beneath many layers of history. The ancient city that was once a center of learning and power in the Mediterranean world has now become a major city of modern Egypt. Stretching along the coast with its seaside road, traffic, apartment buildings, cafes, harbor, ship horns, and the breath of salt still moving through the wind. But if you stand long enough before the waters of Alexandria today, you can still feel that something has not entirely disappeared. The harbor is still there. Its position facing the Mediterranean is still there. The waves still touch the stone shore as they once touched the hulls of merchants, sailors, and travelers more than 2,000 years ago. The difference is that the city of books, temples, and the fire of Pharos has receded into memory. While Alexandria today is a city alive in the present, noisier, more crowded, yet still carrying within it the long shadow of a place that once believed the knowledge of the whole world could be gathered on this shore. As the boat moved deeper in, the shapes of the island of Pharos and the long causeway connecting the island to the mainland began to appear in the dim light. That connecting structure divided the waters into different harbor areas, creating a space that human hands had arranged out of the sea itself. On one side was the place where ships entered, anchored, and unloaded cargo. On the other, the water was quieter, darker, reflecting the sky as it slowly grew pale. Alexandria did not allow the sea to decide its fate entirely. The city had drawn stone out into the water, connected island to mainland, created docks, raised a tower, and opened a path for streams of people and goods to flow into the center of its power. Before dawn, the harbor had awakened before the rest of the city. The people who worked here did not wait for the sun to rise high before beginning the day. In the darkness that still remained, one man checked the anchor ropes. Another called out in a hoarse voice after a sleepless night. Another carried sacks down onto the dock. Another recorded the name of a ship, the source of its cargo, its quantity, and its destination. Voices rang out in many languages, sometimes blending together into a sound difficult to separate. The Greek of the ruling dynasty and the urban community, the Egyptian of the ancient land beneath the new city, the speech of merchants from many shores, the short commands of people used to moving goods on time. Alexandria did not wake to birdsong. It woke to the harbor. There was a very particular life in that air. The smell of sea salt mingled with fish, wet wood, resin, oil, coarse fabric, the bodies of laborers, and somewhere there was the dry, faintly sweet scent of papyrus bundled for transport. Clay amphorae were set down carefully so they would not break. Baskets of goods were dragged across the stone. A draft animal shifted restlessly on its feet. A harbor guard looked up at the sky to judge the weather. A young sailor stood still for a moment, not because he had never seen a large city before, but because Alexandria had a way of making newcomers feel they were stepping into a place where the world was wider than they had imagined. Now the eastern light had begun to thin the darkness along the horizon. The sea was no longer black, but had turned silver gray. The outlines of the city gradually appeared, first as large forms near the harbor, walls, docks, storehouses, columns, roofs, buildings tied to the royal quarter and commercial life. Alexandria did not resemble a fishing village that had grown naturally by the shore. It bore the shape of a place that had been imagined, drawn, and placed precisely so that it could look toward the sea and turn back toward Egypt at the same time. Though newcomers could not yet see all the streets within, they could already feel that order from outside the harbor, the waterfront, the routes, the storehouses, the officials, the carriers, the light above, and the ceaseless currents of movement. If you listen closely, you will realize that the harbor of Alexandria was like the opening movement of a long piece of music. It had not yet told the whole story of the city, but it had already introduced all its most important themes. Here there was the sea, and because there was the sea, there was trade, Because there was trade, there was money, taxation, goods, and wealth. Because there was wealth, the royal court could build palaces, temples, storehouses, lighthouses, and places for scholars. Because ships traveled everywhere, news and texts could cross distance. And from all those things that seemed so material, a new center of knowledge could begin to form. This matters deeply because Alexandria is often remembered through the image of the library, as though knowledge appeared there in a quiet room, separated from sweat, trade, and the noise of daily life. But if we enter the city from the sea, we understand that the dream of knowledge began at the harbor. Every scroll needed a road to reach its destination. Every scholar needed food, light, shelter, and patronage. Every debate in the more learned spaces deeper inside the city was supported by the people carrying goods at dawn, by captains who knew how to read the wind, by those who recorded accounts, collected taxes, sold oil, transported wheat, and tied mooring ropes with calloused hands. The sun had not fully risen yet, but a pale gold had begun to touch the top of the lighthouse. The fire on Pharos was no longer as striking as it had been in the night, but the tower still stood there, high and brightening in the early air. In the coming hours, natural light would replace the guiding flame. The ships entering the harbor would no longer need to look up at Pharos as much as they had in the dark. But that symbol would not lose its weight. It reminded everyone that Alexandria was a place that knew how to use light. Light to guide ships, light to display power, and on a deeper level, light to say that this city wanted to become a place where human beings could find their way through a world too vast, too full of languages, too full of memories, and too full of things not yet understood. You can stand still for a while on the dock and let everything pass before your eyes. A group of sailors from a newly arrived ship is unloading cargo. An older man steps down, clutching tightly a leather bag at his side, perhaps containing documents, letters, or some small item that must be protected from damp. Nearby, local laborers are so used to this rhythm that they show no surprise at the new faces. An early food seller lights a small fire, and thin smoke rises into the cold air. A few soldiers or officials stand near the entrance, watching more than speaking. The city welcomes strangers, but not innocently. Where there are many goods, much gold and silver, and great power, there must always be people to guard it. Seen from the harbor, Alexandria appeared like a promise with many layers. To merchants, it promised a market. To sailors, it promised a harbor. To officials, it promised taxes and order. To learners, it promised books, patronage, reputation, and the chance to be near some of the sharpest minds of the age. To ordinary people, it was a place to earn a living, a place of crowding, hope, exhaustion, and days that began very early and ended when the body was worn out. A great city never belongs only to the people whose names are recorded in history. It also belongs to those who leave no names behind, but who make the city continue breathing every day. As the sun rose higher, the walls and roofs near the harbor began to change color. The stone was no longer cold gray, but warmed little by little. On the water, long streaks of light trembled among the shadows of ships. Voices became clearer, Wheels began to roll. Calls from one dock to another, connected like invisible threads. The harbor was no longer a misted place in the night, but a space full of movement. And it was precisely in that movement that we could understand why Alexandria was placed here. Between sea and Egypt. Between roots and ambition. Between the outer world and the land of the Nile behind it. In 150 BC, Alexandria was no longer a young city newly raised from the idea of Alexander. It had already had more than a century and a half to grow, to accumulate renown, to become the center of the Ptolemaic dynasty and a bright point of the Hellenistic world on Egyptian soil. Kings had come and gone. Struggles for power had left their marks. Generations of scholars had read, written, debated, and disappeared. But every morning, the harbor still had to open its eyes first. Ships still came. Cargo was still unloaded. News still followed the waves into the city. And Pharaoh still stood there, as though no matter how time might change, Alexandria still wanted to be seen from afar. There is a very strange beauty in the moment before a city has fully awakened, inside the neighborhoods. Many people were probably still asleep. Houses had not all opened their doors. The scholarly spaces and the palaces deeper in the city had not yet entered the noisy rhythm of the day. But out here, where the sea touched the stone, the whole story had already begun. The listener can feel that they are standing on the boundary between two worlds. Behind them is night, the sea, the journey. Ahead is the city, the streets, power, knowledge, and the questions that will gradually open through the long day to come. And perhaps that is the right way to enter Alexandria. Not through a list of famous things, not through numbers repeated across the centuries, but through the feeling of a person arriving from the sea, seeing the fire of Pharos, hearing the harbor wake, and slowly understanding that this city did not become great only because it had a library. It was great because it knew how to gather the different currents of the world into one place: goods, people, languages, gods, power, books, and memory. Before a scroll was opened in a reading room, it had to pass through the sea wind. Before an idea was debated in a learned space, it had to be nourished by the living city outside. Now, as morning light spreads across the water, we leave the edge of the harbor in our imagination. Behind us, Pharos still rises high, no longer a lonely flame in the night, but a block of stone brightening beneath the sun. Ahead, Alexandria is opening layer by layer, from the docks to the streets, from the storehouses to the royal quarter, from the sound of labor to the quieter spaces of power and wisdom. But in this first moment, keep hold of the most important image: a boat entering the harbor before dawn, a lighthouse guiding the way over the dark sea, and an ancient city waking slowly, vast and deep, as though the whole memory of the world were preparing to open its eyes with it. As you leave the edge of the harbor, Alexandria begins to change before your eyes. The sound of waves and mooring ropes still lingers behind you, but the deeper you move into the city, the more the voice of the sea begins to blend into another rhythm of life. The sound of wheels rolling over stone, people calling to one another from the far end of the street, wooden doors opening, draft animals breathing heavily as they pull their loads, sandals passing over roads that human hands have measured and carefully arranged. This is not a city that rose by chance beside the water. Alexandria carries the feeling of an idea first drawn in the mind, and only afterward built from stone, sweat, power, and time, more than a century and a half before the day we are imagining. Alexander the Great passed through this stretch of coast during his conquest of Egypt. At that time, this place was not yet the dazzling center of the Mediterranean. It was closer to an old fishing settlement than to a great metropolis, lying near the island of Pharos, facing the sea and resting its back against the inland waters of Lake Mareotis. But to someone like Alexander, someone who did not look at land merely as land, but as the future shape of destiny, this position held a special power. It stood between Egypt and the Greek world, between the Nile and the Mediterranean, between a continent rich in wheat and the sea routes that connected many kingdoms. Alexander would not live long enough to see the city that bore his name grow to maturity. He left, continuing his conquests farther east, and only a few years later, his death sent the vast empire into the hands of generals struggling for power. But the name Alexandria remained, a name that was both a memory and a declaration. It reminded everyone that this city had been born from the ambition of a man who wanted to connect many worlds together. And when the Ptolemaic dynasty took power in Egypt, they did not forget that idea. On the contrary, they turned it into the foundation of a new capital, a place that could look out to sea, control trade, receive Greek culture, and at the same time stand upon the ancient wealth of Egyptian soil. If you stepped into Alexandria in 150 BC, the first thing that might surprise you would not be chaos, but a sense of order. The main streets were broader and straighter than those of many other ancient cities. They did not wind entirely according to the older habits of inhabitants, but were laid out with intention. Great roads crossed one another, opening pathways for people, carts, goods, and soldiers to move through, in certain places. Looking down a morning street, you might see light stretching along the stone pavement, with house fronts, columns, gates, shops, and moving figures on either side. The city did not merely want to contain people, it wanted to direct their movement. The farther you went, the more clearly you could feel that Alexandria was a city of many layers. Near the harbor was the rhythm of trade, storehouses, sailors, and dock workers. Deeper inside were neighborhoods of homes, shops, and small workshops, where people began an ordinary day by buying and selling, cooking, repairing, calling their children, checking goods, preparing documents, or going to work, farther still, toward the areas tied to power. The city became more solemn. Larger buildings appeared, spaces opened wider, pathways grew broader, and in the very way the stones were set upon one another, you could feel the presence of the royal court. The Ptolemaic kings understood very well that a foreign dynasty on Egyptian soil needed more than an army. They needed a center that could persuade Greeks, Macedonians, merchants, officials, and scholars that this new power was not merely a temporary occupation. Alexandria, therefore, was not only an administrative capital, it was the great stage of the dynasty. Here, power was made visible through palaces, Rituals, harbors, streets, temples, monuments, and public works. Every ship entering the harbor, every stranger walking across the great road, seemed to pass through a silent reminder that Egypt was now governed from this place, from this city looking out over the Mediterranean. That did not mean Alexandria erased ancient Egypt. Behind the city lay an entire land with thousands of years of memory: the Nile, temples, rituals, villages along the river, ancient gods, the flood season, fields of grain, systems of taxation and food production upon which earlier dynasties had relied. But Alexandria changed the direction of power's gaze. Instead of turning only inward toward the Nile Valley, as many older centers had done, it turned outward toward the sea. It told the world that Egypt was not only a land of pyramids, desert, and ancient gods. Egypt under the Ptolemies was also a Mediterranean kingdom, a place capable of negotiating, competing, exchanging, and displaying itself before the other powers of the Hellenistic age. You can imagine the city as a vast bridge. One end of the bridge rested upon Egypt, upon wheat, papyrus, taxation, labor, the water of the Nile, and native traditions. The other end rested upon the sea, upon merchant ships, the Greek language, the cities of the Aegean, Syria, Cyprus, Rhodes, and regions even farther away. Between those two ends stood Alexandria, where everything passed through, was recorded, calculated, taxed, bought, sold, transferred, and sometimes transformed into cultural power. The larger the city became, the more crowded that bridge grew, and when the bridge became crowded enough, it no longer merely connected worlds. It began to become the center. An important part of Alexandria's strength came from its position between the seaport and Lake Mareotis. If the sea opened the city outward to the Mediterranean, then the lake and the waterways behind it connected Alexandria to inland Egypt. Goods from the Nile could be brought into this region, and from there carried out through the harbor to distant places. Egyptian wheat, one of the vital food sources of the ancient world, not only fed people within the country, but also became an instrument of commerce and politics. Sacks of grain, boats, and waterside storehouses might have looked very ordinary, but they were the material foundation of greatness. Without food, without the harbor, without waterways, every palace, temple, and scholarly dream would have struggled to endure. As the sun rose higher, you began to see more clearly the many faces of the city. Alexandria did not belong to a single community. There were Greeks and Macedonians connected to the machinery of government, the army, trade, and urban culture. There were native Egyptians, bringing with them the language, customs, occupations, and long memory of this land. There was a large Jewish community, and there were merchants and travelers from many different places on the streets. That diversity was not always peaceful, but it created a very particular atmosphere. A stranger could hear many voices in the same morning, see many kinds of clothing, many ways of greeting, many goods, many beliefs, and many ways of looking at the world coexisting on a single road. It was this mixture that made Alexandria different from many traditional Egyptian cities. It was not entirely Greek, even though the face of its power clearly carried a Greek color, nor was it entirely detached from Egypt, because no city on this land could live without relying on the Nile, on labor, on tradition and on the networks of production and administration that had existed for a long time. Alexandria was like a new body assembled from many parts. Its head turned toward the sea. Its feet stood on Egyptian soil. Its heart beat inside the palace of the Ptolemies, and its breath came from ships and from the waters behind it. Its greatness lay in its ability to keep those parts moving together, even though tension always remained beneath the surface. If you walk through the neighborhoods in the morning, you would see that power did not reside only in the palace. It lived in the way the city was organized. Here, wide streets helped carts move faster. The harbor was managed so that goods did not simply arrive, but were recorded and controlled. Storehouses transformed produce into the property of the state or of great merchants. The areas near the royal quarter were placed so that the court always remained close to the sea, close to information, close to important routes of movement. The city therefore functioned as an instrument of rule. It was not only the place where the king lived, it was the way the king saw, listened, received, and distributed power. And at the center of all this was the memory of Alexander. Though he was not the one who fully built this city, his shadow still covered it. His name lived inside the city's name. His fame gave Alexandria, from the very beginning, an international aura, as though it had been born from a dream of joining East and West, the Ptolemaic kings, when ruling Egypt, could draw upon that legacy to strengthen their own position. They did not merely say that they were men who held power after war. They could place themselves within the continuation of Alexander, the conqueror who had opened the door to a new age, for that reason. Alexandria was not merely a place of residence. It was an inherited symbol, and then a symbol used with great intelligence. And yet, walking through the city in 150 BC, we should also feel that this glory was no longer young. Alexandria had already passed through many reigns, many tensions, many disturbances within the Ptolemaic family, and pressure from powers outside Egypt. A great city never contains beauty alone. Inside it are also calculation, rivalry, anxiety, resentment, and cracks that are hard to see. Near the palace, solemnity might conceal struggles for power. In the streets, prosperity might stand beside poverty. At the harbor, every object passing through brought benefit to someone, while someone else had to labor heavily to move it to the right place. Alexandria was a center, but to be a center meant having to bear the weight of every current flowing into it. Perhaps that was why this city felt both alluring and somewhat distant. To a newcomer, Alexandria could overwhelm with its scale, its order, and its sense that it knew its own importance. But living inside it was something else. People did not cross those wide streets every day in order to think about history. They crossed them because they needed to work, to sell goods, to meet someone, to deliver papers, to buy food, to move cargo from the docks to the storehouses, to find shade when the Egyptian sun began to grow harsh. The more famous a city becomes in the memory of later generations, the easier it is to forget that it was once made from countless ordinary days like these. The morning continued to widen. Sunlight fell across stone columns, entered passageways, and made the fine dust in the air more visible. From a higher stretch of road, or an open space between buildings. You could turn back and look toward the sea. Pharos still stood in the distance. The harbor still moved, but now you had seen more of the inner shape of the promise that light had announced. Alexandria was not only a stopping place for ships. It was a political design, a city placed in exactly the right position to draw the world into itself, and then use what it had drawn in to build reputation, wealth, and power. Here, everything seemed to move in a direction larger than itself. A road was not only a road, but a route by which goods entered the center. A harbor was not only a harbor, but the gateway of the state. A granary was not only a place to store food, but a material part of power. A palace was not only where the king lived, but a stage upon which the Ptolemaic dynasty proved that it deserved to rule Egypt. Even the name Alexandria was not only the name of a city, it was a sign, a mark of the age after Alexander. When new kingdoms tried to construct their own identities upon the fragments of a vast empire, and the strangest thing was that, as you walked through those streets, you could feel the city as both very new and very ancient. New, because it carried the planning and spirit of the Hellenistic age, of people who wanted to rebuild the world according to a different order. Ancient, because it stood on Egyptian soil, where every stone, every stream of water, and every flood season seemed to hold a memory longer than any dynasty. Alexandria did not completely break with the past, nor did it lie still inside the past. It used the past as its ground, the sea as its doorway, the name of Alexander as its banner, and Ptolemaic power as the organizing hand. By mid-morning, the city had fully awakened. The great streets were more crowded. Goods from the harbor had begun to move deeper inside. People from the neighborhoods poured out, each following a separate purpose. The shadows beneath the columns became precious. Shops opened wider. Those who worked for the state, for merchants, for wealthy families, for temples, or for small workshops were all drawn into the common rhythm. The city did not need anyone standing in a public square to announce that it was the center of Egypt. It proved that by functioning, by the ceaseless flow of people, goods, money, and information through it. Yet amid all that movement, if you slowed your steps, you could hear a deeper story. This was the story of how an idea became a city. Alexander left behind the name and the vision. The Ptolemies left behind organization, money, palaces, and the ambition to rule. The sea left behind roads that opened toward the world. The Nile left behind the source of life. The people, laborers, merchants, record keepers, craftsmen, soldiers, and immigrants left behind the daily breath of the city. No single one of those parts was enough to create Alexandria on its own, but when all of them met on this shore, they produced a center that, for many centuries, people would remember as one of the strangest and most influential cities of the ancient world. And so, as this morning chapter of the journey comes to a close, hold on to the image of Alexandria not as a still painting, but as a city in motion. Behind us are Pharos and the harbor, where everything began with light, water, and ships. Ahead are the deeper regions of power, knowledge, and belief, where the city will gradually reveal other layers of meaning. But at this moment, the most important thing to understand is this. Alexandria became the center of Egypt not only because it was named after Alexander, And not only because it possessed great monuments, it became the center because it knew how to stand in the right place between worlds, and then transform that position into power. And in the rising sunlight, with the voice of the harbor still sounding behind you, you can feel the city as though it is inviting you onward, not hurriedly, not too loudly, only step by step, through broad, straight roads, over warm stone beneath your feet, through layers of people and sound, until you understand why, from a stretch of coast that had once been far more silent. Alexandria became the new heart of Egypt under the Ptolemies, a heart beating to the rhythm of the sea, the Nile, trade, power, and a dream that was never small. Leaving the broad streets, now brightening beneath the early sun, you walk toward a more solemn quarter of Alexandria. The harbor is still somewhere behind you, with the sound of mooring ropes, cargo crates, and voices calling to one another through the wind. But the closer you come to the royal district, the more those sounds begin to recede, as though the city itself is lowering its voice as it enters a place where power and knowledge live side by side. Larger walls appear. The passageways become cleaner, wider. The shadows of columns stretch long across the stone floor. The air here is not completely silent, but it is different from the noise of the harbor. It carries a slow kind of order, like a great room just waking after a long night. The Mouseion belonged to that world, close to the palace, close to the hand of the royal court, yet moving to a rhythm of its own. From the outside, it did not appear like a mystical place separated from daily life by magic. It appeared through stone, through courtyards, through covered walkways, through pockets of shade, through the soft touch of sandals on the floor, through men walking slowly with scrolls tucked beneath their arms. One man lowered his head as if still thinking through an unfinished sentence. Another walked while murmuring a passage of ancient poetry to himself. Someone else stopped in the shade, placed a hand beneath his chin, and listened to another man read aloud a line of text they were still debating. The morning light entered the Mouseion without being too harsh. It passed through the rows of columns, breaking into long strips of brightness across the stone floor, then settling on benches, low steps, pale walls, and quiet corners for sitting. In this place, knowledge did not only take the form of books, it had the shape of a body bending down. It had the sound of a soft breath when someone reached a difficult sentence. It had fingers touching the dry surface of papyrus. It had the faint frown of a scholar discovering that two copied texts did not match. It had the moment of silence before a debate began, when everyone understood that a single word, a single pause, a single mistaken interpretation could change the meaning of an entire passage. You can imagine a long portico where scholars walked slowly back and forth in the shade. They were not hurried like people in the market, nor physically burdened like the porters outside the harbor, but they were not idle. Their fatigue lived in their eyes, in their bent backs, in the night spent too long beside oil lamps, in minds that continued working even while the body was walking. One man stopped beside a column and opened a scroll just enough to check a line. Another came closer, listened to a few sentences, then shook his head very slightly. They did not speak loudly, but their voices were sharp. not the voices of men trying to win through volume, but of men who believed that truth sometimes lived inside a detail so small that an ordinary person would pass over it. Here, a day did not begin with the cry of street vendors, but with the reopening of yesterday's questions. Someone was reading Homer. Someone else was comparing poetic texts copied from different places. Another was writing notes beside a passage, with such care that every stroke of ink seemed to be placed down after a moment of thought. Another man sat near the doorway, with fragments of notes before him on language, names, places, pronunciation, and the origin of a story. This space did not resemble a modern classroom, where everyone faces a single lectern. It was more like a roofed garden of the mind, where each small group pursued its own question, while all still belonged to the same great dream of Alexandria, to read more carefully, to remember longer, to understand more deeply, at times. The main sound inside the Mouseion was the sound of reading. Ancient people often read aloud, and in spaces like this, writing was not entirely silent the way it is on the pages we know today. A passage of poetry might rise in a steady low voice. An old sentence might be repeated many times, with a slightly different emphasis each time. That sound spread beneath the roofed walkway, touched the stone columns, then dissolved into the courtyard. If you stood nearby, you could hear the rhythm of words that had passed through many generations before arriving in Alexandria. There were lines loved for their beauty. There were lines dissected because they were doubted. There were lines placed beside another version to see which word was older, which was the error of a scribe, and which was an addition made by time. The scent within the Mouseion was also different from the scent outside the harbor. The strong smell of fish, salt, and wet wood was gone. Here there was the smell of dry papyrus, of ink, of fine dust on stone, of linen garments warmed in the sun, of oil from lamps left over from the night. From time to time, when a wind moved in from the courtyard, it carried a very faint scent of greenery, just enough to soften the air. A person could sit for a long time in that scent, reading until the light changed, until a line that seemed familiar suddenly became strange because of a new question. One of the strangest things about the Mouseion was that it was not merely a place one came to work and then left. For many scholars supported by the royal court, it was almost a way of life. They ate in the same space, met one another in the passageways, debated in the shade, carried the conversation from the dining table to the stone portico, from the portico to the reading room, from the reading room back into uneasy sleep. You can picture a shared meal, not too loud, yet full of broken pieces of conversation. One person mentions a line from the Iliad. Another counters with a version copied from somewhere else. An older man does not speak immediately, only dips bread into diluted wine, listens to the end, and then slowly offers a remark that makes the whole table fall silent for a few seconds. Knowledge here had a life very close to the body. A scholar, too, had to feel hunger, strained eyes, an aching back, the need for shade in the heat of the day, the need to find a place with enough light to read, the need to keep a scroll from damp, the need to ask a scribe to copy a text when an older version had begun to wear away. Nothing in this shone like the legend of an endless treasure. It was slow labor. It was patience. It was eyes looking again and again at a sentence. It was the hand opening a scroll carefully so the edge of the papyrus would not tear. It was the care of someone who knew that a text might outlive his body by a very long time, but might also vanish because of a drop of water, a spark of fire, a hurried copying error, or a period of disorder. At the moment we are passing through, around the year 150 BC, Alexandria was still a place toward which lovers of letters and thought turned their eyes. Earlier, great generations had left their fame upon the city. Mathematicians, geographers, physicians, poets, and textual critics had passed through these corridors of intellect, leaving behind not footprints in stone, but methods, habits, and severity of mind. At this time, people still spoke of the minds that had measured the earth, studied the body, named, classified, compared, and debated. But in the morning Mouseion, that past was not set inside a cold monument. It lived in the way a young scholar bent down more carefully, because he knew he was walking after those who had made Alexandria famous. In a quieter corner, there may have been a group discussing language, not with the light curiosity of someone listening to a story, but with a focus almost tense. What meaning should a word in an ancient poem carry? Had a place name been copied incorrectly through many versions? Did a story in an epic come from an actual memory, or had poetry made it larger than life? They could not return to the past and ask the person who had written it. They had only the scroll before them, different copies, the memory of earlier readers, and their own rigor in the light slanting through the portico. That conversation sounded both small and vast. Small because they were debating a single word, vast because through a single word, they were trying to keep memory from drifting any farther away. Elsewhere, the debate might turn toward the stars, numbers, the path of the sun, the shape of the earth, the distance between regions, the arrangement of calendars, the recording of time. A small board might be placed upon the table. A few fine lines appeared. A finger followed an imagined arc. No one needed to explain too much for the listener to feel that Alexandria did not only read what the ancients had left behind. This city also wanted to measure the world, name the world, turn what was immense into a form that could be remembered. But here, in this morning chapter, we do not need to go deeply into each invention or each name. We only need to look at the hands drawing, the eyes following, and feel one thing. Inside the Mouseion, the world outside was brought into letters, numbers, and speech. Even so, the Mouseion was not only a place of harmony. Those who lived by the mind often carried the pride of the mind as well. A reply could be sharp as a small blade. A younger scholar might remain silent because he did not yet have enough reputation to enter the discussion. An older man might not easily accept a new reading. Sometimes a debate could last so long that an outsider no longer knew whether they were defending the text or defending their own names. But even that tension was part of this place. Alexandria did not merely gather knowledge into one location to admire it. It made knowledge collide, and in those collisions, sometimes light was born, and sometimes only fatigue, rivalry, and very human scratches remained. You can continue through another corridor where the light is weaker. There, several scribes are at work. They are not necessarily famous scholars, but this intellectual space needs them as it needs breath. Before them are papyrus scrolls, ink, reed pens, and small knives for correcting the writing surface when necessary. They sit for a long time, keeping their backs and hands in a posture familiar enough to hurt. Each line is written slowly. Each small error may be discovered, corrected, or sometimes carried unknowingly into another copy. This work is not noisy. No one raises statues for each scribe, but without them, the debates of scholars would have no body with which to travel far. Here, time has a very different rhythm. Outside, in the streets, morning moves by footsteps, by cargo, by quick exchanges before the heat rises. Inside the Mouseion, time moves by each passage opened, each sentence read again, each remark written down, each shared meal where the conversation refuses to end. One person might spend an entire morning simply comparing a passage. Another might lose many days to a problem that an outsider would consider very small. But that very slowness is what gives this place its special character. In Alexandria, knowledge was not a sudden flash of lightning descending from above. It was like water dripping on stone, drop by drop, day by day, patient enough to leave a mark in the end. And all of this took place beneath the shadow of the royal court. You did not need to see the king to feel that power was nearby. It was present in the very fact that these scholars were supported, given a place to work, allowed to remain near the palace, and included in a community that ordinary people could not easily enter. The walls, courtyards, shared dining room, and covered walkways all reminded you that knowledge in Alexandria was cared for, but also placed within a framework. It did not flow freely in the streets. It lived close to power, received shade from power, and for that reason could never be entirely separate from changes in power. But for the person sitting beside a scroll, perhaps such matters did not always appear clearly in the moment of reading. The world could shrink until only a single line remained. An old word opened before the eyes. A verse seemed to awaken after many centuries. The scholar leaned closer, lips moving almost silently. Outside, Alexandria was noisy. Ships were entering the harbor. Goods were passing through warehouses. Wheels were rolling over the streets. But in that moment, the whole city seemed to withdraw behind him, making room for the strange meeting between a living human being and a voice that had been dead for a very long time. That is the deepest beauty of the Mouseion. It was not only a place where people knew many things, it was a place where the living sat face to face with the dead through writing. An ancient poet, an old storyteller, a physician who had once observed the body, a recorder of distant place names. All could return inside this quiet room in the fragile form of papyrus and ink. Each time a scroll was opened, the past did not entirely come back to life, but it was listened to once more. And perhaps, for a civilization, being listened to once more was already a way of not yet disappearing. Near midday, the light inside the Mouseion began to change. The long strips of brightness on the stone floor grew shorter. The shade beneath the columns became more precious. A few people stood up, rolled their texts closed, and tied the cords carefully. Several small groups had still not finished their conversation, walking as they spoke, their hands gesturing in the air as though drawing an invisible argument. In one corner, a scribe paused and gently rubbed his tired fingers. At another table, a young scholar looked for a long time at the final line before closing the scroll, as though he did not yet want to leave the world it had just opened. You walk slowly through that space and feel Alexandria become deeper than it had seemed from the harbor. Outside, the city is stone, ships, goods, streets, and power. Inside the Mouseion, it is memory, voices reading, hands copying, shared meals, small debates beneath columns, and questions that refuse to sleep. There is no great roar here, no battle, no scene that overwhelms at once. There is only another kind of fire, smaller than the flame of Pharos, but enduring in its own way. The fire of human beings trying to understand what had been written, what had happened, what could be measured, remembered, and preserved. And when you leave the Mouseion in imagination, you can carry with you a very quiet image, a covered corridor near midday, bright columns on one side, cool shade on the other, a papyrus scroll freshly opened in the hands of a reader. That person does not know that more than 2,000 years later, we would still be trying to imagine the place where he stood. He only knows that before him is a line of text that needs to be understood more accurately than yesterday. And perhaps that is precisely why Alexandria once became the intellectual center of the ancient world. Not only because it had many texts, many scholars, and many buildings, but because at some moment, in rooms and corridors like these, human beings believed that understanding a single line was worth an entire lifetime of patience. Inside Alexandria, there were places that were not as noisy as the harbor, not as open as the streets, and not as outwardly splendid as the palace. Yet it was precisely those places that caused this city to be remembered longer than most of the thrones that ever stood upon Egyptian soil. They were spaces of papyrus, ink, binding cords, small labels, storage racks, readers, scribes, and scrolls brought in from many different lands. If the Mouseion was the place where scholars lived, worked, and debated, then the Library of Alexandria was the quieter heart of that dream. It did not beat with drums or the cries of a crowd. It beat with the very soft sound of a scroll being opened in the daylight. Imagine yourself stepping into a space cooler than the world outside. The Egyptian sun still blazes over the stone courtyards, but here the light has been softened by roofs, by thick walls, by corridors where shade lies still like water. The air has its own particular scent, the dry smell of papyrus, the smell of ink soaked into plant fibers, the thin dust of stone and wood, the faint oil left behind by lamps used after dark. There are no thousands of books standing upright with their spines facing outward, as in a modern library. In Alexandria, books had a different shape. They were scrolls, wound around a core, tied with cords, placed in boxes, chests, or storage compartments, sometimes with a small tag bearing the name of the author or the work, so that someone in need could find it among the countless voices gathered here. An ancient scroll did not open like a familiar book. It had to be held with both hands. One side was slowly unrolled, while the other was gradually rolled back in. The reader did not turn pages, but drew time horizontally across the eyes. Lines of writing appeared in sections, then disappeared again into the side being rolled. This way of reading made each text feel like a narrow road. You could not see the whole thing at once. You moved through it slowly, line by line, breath by breath, pause by pause. In that slowness, the reader might feel that he was not only reading words, but reopening an old voice that had been asleep in darkness. In this place, there were texts of poetry, epic, drama, medicine, mathematics, geography, astronomy, law, philosophy, ritual, language, and countless records whose names time had blurred. Some scrolls may have contained works known to many. Others may have been only modest copies, brought from a distant city, from the hand of an obscure scribe, from the private collection of a family, or from the luggage of a traveler arriving at the harbor. But once they entered Alexandria, they no longer belonged only to the place that had given birth to them. They became part of a larger ambition, an ambition that drove this city to gather, compare, arrange, and protect the knowledge of the world it knew. You can imagine a morning in the library when new scrolls were brought in. They did not enter in absolute silence. There was the sound of footsteps carrying them, the sound of boxes set down on wood or stone, the sound of cords being untied, the voice of one person asking about the origin of the text, another writing down a few necessary lines. One scroll had come from a ship that had just entered the harbor. Another had been copied from an older version. One had damp along its edge and needed to be examined carefully. Another had clear writing, its black ink still firmly held upon the surface of the papyrus. Another made a reader frown from the very first lines, because it differed from the version he already knew. In Alexandria, differences between texts were not a small matter. An ancient poem might exist in many copied versions, each carrying a slightly different word, a rearranged sentence, a passage added or omitted. A work passing through generations was like a stream flowing through many lands. It kept its main shape, but it also carried mud, sand, fallen leaves, and the traces of hands that had touched it. For that reason, the work of the scholar was not simply to read in order to know. They had to listen as texts argued with one another. They placed one version beside another, comparing sentence by sentence, word by word, sometimes sound by sound. A very small difference could open an entire long debate beneath the shade of the columns. That scene did not need to be loud in order to be captivating. Imagine a man sitting beside a narrow window, where just enough light falls onto the scroll before him. Beside him lie several different copies of the same work. He opens one version, reads a line silently, then opens the second and searches for the corresponding passage. His finger stops. There is a word that does not match. He does not rush to a conclusion. He reads again, presses his lips together, leans closer, then writes a small mark. Outside, the city is still moving, but in that moment, his entire world has narrowed to a tiny point of ink on papyrus. A wrong word could bend an idea out of shape. A right word could rescue the voice of someone who had been dead for a very long time. In another corner, the scribes are at work. They are not always the ones later generations remember by name, but their labor supports the entire dream of Alexandria. Before them is a model scroll and a fresh writing surface. A reed pen dips into ink, then descends in steady strokes. When one writes for a long time, the hand grows tired, the eyes begin to sting, the back begins to ache. But that steadiness is how a text is doubled, sent onward, preserved, and saved from the damage of time. Each copy is both a new life and a new risk, because the hand of the scribe can preserve correctly, but it can also make mistakes. Knowledge passes through human beings, and so it always carries human fragility with it. The space of the library, therefore, was never entirely still. It had small sounds, but they were continuous. The sound of scrolls opening, the sound of cords sliding across papyrus, the sound of reed pens touching the writing surface, the sound of someone murmuring as he checked the rhythm of a sentence, the sound of a person calling the name of a work from somewhere far off, the sound of footsteps stopping before a storage compartment, the very soft sigh of someone who could not find the text he needed. From a distance, all of it was almost only a layer of whispering. But if you came close, you would see that each sound was part of the work of preserving memory. Perhaps what made the Library of Alexandria special was not only the number of texts that people once attributed to it over time. Those numbers have become difficult to know with certainty, and the more they are retold, the more they resemble mist around a legend. What mattered more was the spirit behind them. Here, people once dreamed that knowledge could be gathered together, not inside the memory of a single person, not within the tradition of one separate city, but inside a larger system, a place where works from many lands could meet, a place where different versions of the same voice could be set beside one another, a place where the memory of humanity, or at least the part of humanity Alexandria could reach, could be rolled up, tied with cord, labeled, and placed in the shade. That dream was both beautiful and very bold, for in the ancient world, knowledge did not move easily as it does today. A text needed someone to copy it. A copy needed materials. Materials required plants, water, skill, money, and transportation. A scroll had to be protected from damp, fire, insects, war, and forgetfulness. Every small thing could make a work disappear. If no one copied it, it died. If a storehouse burned, it died. If a language no longer had readers, it died more slowly. But it died all the same, for that reason. Every scroll lying quietly in the library was not merely an object. It was a fragile living thing being kept breathing by the care of an entire city. Sometimes, while walking between the storage spaces and the quiet corridors, you might feel that the library was like a second seaport. The harbor outside received ships, goods, and strangers. This place received other voyages, the voyages of written words. A scroll of poetry from the Aegean docked like a small vessel. A medical record from an earlier generation was set down like a precious crate. A work of geography opened distant shores the reader may never have seen. A play carried the laughter and pain of another city. All of them came here, no longer by sail and oar, but by papyrus and ink, then anchored themselves in the memory of Alexandria. But not every text that arrived here was treated in the same way. Some needed to be copied immediately because they were rare. Some needed to be examined because their accuracy was uncertain. Some excited the reader. Some disappointed him. Some were simply placed in a modest position, waiting for someone in the future to need them. The work of arranging knowledge was not as spectacular as building a lighthouse, but it required an architecture of its own. People had to think of ways to name, classify, remember locations, retrieve works, distinguish authors, identify variants, and record what needed to be known. Without order, a great storehouse of texts could become a maze with no way out. Imagine a person in charge walking slowly among the scrolls, his eyes following the small tags, his hand checking the chords. He cannot read everything in a single day, nor can he keep everything in his memory. But he knows that every object here needs a place, and every place is a way of resisting chaos. Out there, the sea can cause ships to lose their way. In here, knowledge can also lose its way if it is not marked. A scroll placed in the wrong location might disappear from the person who needs it for many years. A wrongly recorded author's name could lead to confusions longer than a lifetime. Therefore, the quietness of the library was not passivity. It was a form of vigilance at a nearby table. There may have been a scholar reading the commentary of someone who came before him. He was not only facing the ancient author, but also the people who had read that author before him. Along the margins of tradition, voices were stacked upon one another. One person explained a word, another disagreed, a third proposed a new interpretation. Over time, a great work no longer traveled alone. It carried with it an entire procession of readers, correctors, protectors, and doubters. In the library of Alexandria, those invisible processions met, and sometimes the living sat among them, small and patient, trying to hear which voice came closest to the truth. There was a very sorrowful beauty in that work. The people here knew that they were trying to preserve things that could always be lost. They knew that papyrus was not immortal. Ink could fade. A scroll could tear. The power that offered patronage today could change tomorrow. A king who loved knowledge could die. A time of stability could be replaced by intrigue and struggle. A room full of texts could become empty if no one still needed to read them. But precisely because they knew that fragility, their work became all the more precious. They did not preserve knowledge because they were certain it would defeat time. They preserved it because, without preservation, everything would vanish more quickly. In the light near midday, the library might appear very ordinary. No miracle emerged among the scrolls. No secret door opened onto the full truth of the universe. There were only readers, scribes, classifiers, questioners, doubters, and someone quietly tying up a scroll after finishing with it. But if you stood there long enough, you would feel that this ordinariness was exactly the miracle. For every civilization needs people who work in silence so that memory does not disappear. Those who build temples leave behind stone. Those who rule leave their names on coins and decrees. But those who copy books, read books, and preserve books leave behind something harder to see. The possibility that those who come later may still hear those who came before. A scroll is closed. A cord is wrapped around it. The small label is adjusted so it sits straight. The reader returns it to its place, not hurriedly, as though guiding an old person back to rest. Outside, many things are still happening in Alexandria. The harbor is still busy. The streets are still heating beneath the sun. The royal court still has its affairs. But in this moment, in a cooler and quieter place, we understand why the name of the Library of Alexandria has carried such weight for so long. It was not only a building, not only a collection, not only the pride of a dynasty. It was the image of a deeply human longing, the desire that what human beings know, write, measure, imagine, debate, and cherish might be kept before time carries it away. And when you leave that space in your imagination, keep with you the smallest sound of this chapter, the sound of a papyrus scroll being opened. That sound is softer than the waves in the harbor, smaller than the wheels in the street, gentler than the voices debating in the Mouseion, but it carries within it a strange weight, because in that very quiet opening, an entire old world can begin to speak again, a poet who has died, a physician who has passed away, a man who measured the stars, someone who once recorded the names of distant lands. All of them continue to exist only if someone opens the scroll, bends down, and reads. That was the ancient dream of Alexandria, not a dream of immortality in an arrogant sense. As though this city could overcome every upheaval of history, it was a gentler dream, deeper, and perhaps more painful as well, to gather as many small lights as possible before night descended. A scroll was a light, a copy was a light, a careful note in the margin was a light. A patient reader was also a light, and in the shade of the Library of Alexandria. On a distant day around 150 BC, those lights lay beside one another, silent and fragile, as though the whole city were trying to keep the memory of humankind from going out. As you leave the cool gentleness of rooms filled with papyrus, the light outside seems far brighter. Alexandria, at midday, is no longer the blue-shadowed city of dawn, nor the quiet city of scholarly corridors. It opens itself through sunlight, through dust, through human voices, through the smell of hot food, through the sound of wheels grinding softly against stone, and through the sound of goods being dragged along broad passageways. In that light, the city appears very different, not as a symbol of knowledge placed solemnly in memory, but as a great body in constant motion, needing to eat, to exchange, to heal, to transport, to buy and sell, needing ordinary hands to keep everything grand from collapsing. As you step into the busier streets, you hear Alexandria before you can fully see it. The calls of vendors rise in waves, sometimes near, sometimes distant, mixing with footsteps, the sound of draft animals pulling carts, children calling to one another, sellers bargaining with buyers, wooden crates being set down, and clay jars touching one another very softly. A man comes in from the harbor with his clothes still carrying the smell of salt. A woman passes by with a basket in her hand, holding bread, vegetables, dried fish, or small things for the day's meal. A craftsman sits in the shade, carefully repairing an object made of metal. Someone else bends beside a small stove, turning a piece of bread over the heated surface, letting the smell of toasted dough spread through the street, like a reminder that amid all the ambitions of kings and scholars, human beings must first live from one meal to the next. In the market district, colors and sounds grow denser. The stalls do not stand still like objects in a painting, but constantly tremble with the touch of hands, with baskets being lifted and set down, with eyes weighing prices, with voices trying to sell for more and voices trying to pay less. There is fish from nearby waters, salt, oil, wine, vegetables, seasonal fruits, bread, beans, spices, cloth, rope, pottery, small knives, needles, combs, sandals, protective charms, storage jars, baskets, and very small things that are nevertheless necessary for an ordinary day. Buyers do not come here to look at history. They come because the house needs food, the workshop needs materials, the body needs clothing. An evening cannot pass if nothing has been placed on the table by midday. Within that crowd, you can hear many different voices layered over one another. Alexandria is a city where many communities live within the same space, though not always blending together peacefully. Greek rings out in places connected to the machinery of government, commerce, and urban life. Egyptian still lives among the native people, within families, in work, in the long-standing habits of this land. The Jewish community also has a large presence, along with merchants, sailors, and travelers from many different shores, when they pass one another in the market. Sometimes it is only a brief glance, a single exchange of goods, a question about price, a moment of stepping aside beneath the sun. But those small contacts are what make the city a place where the ancient world crosses paths with itself every day. The smell of Alexandria at midday is not as gentle as the smell of papyrus in the library. It is heavier, more real, closer to the body. There is the smell of fresh fish and salted fish, olive oil, cooking smoke, hot bread, wine leaking from clay jars, the sweat of porters, leather, dry grass for animals, dust warmed by the sun on the road. Sometimes, from some corner, the scent of brewed medicine or herbs drifts faintly, distinct from the smell of food. It makes you realize that in a city as crowded as this, it is not only goods that need to be exchanged, but also illness, pain, wounds, and human anxiety that needs somewhere to go. Alexandria had once been famous for its medical tradition, and although the great names of earlier generations already belonged to the past, their echo still remained in the city. But in everyday life, medicine did not appear before ordinary people as a grand story. It appeared as a healer sitting in a cool room, as small jars containing remedies, as the smell of tree resin, dried roots, oil, honey, wine used for washing, cloth used for bandaging, as a mother bringing her feverish child for advice, as a sailor with an injured hand after hauling a mooring rope, as an old person whose joints ached when the sea wind changed. In that place, knowledge was no longer a debate about words in an ancient text, but a very immediate question: how to hurt less, how to keep the wound from worsening, how to help this fragile body endure one more day. Imagine a small room near a crowded street, its door opening toward the shade. On a low table lie a few simple tools, small jars, and bundles of dried plants hung high to keep them away from damp. The healer does not need to be a famous physician recorded in history. He may simply be someone who has learned from those before him, from experience, from texts, from observation, from countless times listening to patients describe the sensations inside their bodies. he asks slowly. Observes the skin, the eyes, the breathing, the wound, the way a person walks, outside the door. The market remains noisy, but inside that room, someone is hoping to hear that their pain can be understood, if only in part. That, too, is a form of Alexandria's wisdom, not found in great dreams, but in the hand that touches the delicate pulse of another living being. Not far from those trading streets, small workshops continue their work. A potter checks the mouth of a jar. Someone repairs rope. Another cuts fabric. Another sharpens a knife. Another closes the lid of a crate so the goods will not be damaged on the road. Such trades are not often placed at the center of great stories, but an ancient city lived by them more than we might imagine. A well-made clay jar helped wine or oil travel farther. A strong rope kept a ship safer. A piece of evenly woven cloth could become clothing, a shade against the sun, a cover for goods, or an object of exchange. Every working hand was connected to the network of the harbor, the market, houses, storehouses, and the boats that came and went. When the sun stands high, shade becomes a precious possession. People press themselves beneath awnings, beside walls, under rows of columns, in front of shops, wherever the light does not strike directly down on their heads. The city may have been built from ambition, but at midday it still has to endure the weather like anywhere else. The elderly walk more slowly. Porters wipe sweat with the edge of their garments. A child running too fast is called back by an adult. A draft animal stands still, its ear flicking slightly because of flies. Those small movements make Alexandria feel closer. We no longer see it as a distant symbol, but as a place where people were once tired, hungry, irritated by the heat, glad to have sold something, worried about prices, and waiting for the day to soften. And then, from those streets, if you gradually move toward the back of the city, you begin to sense another rhythm, the rhythm of inland water. Alexandria did not live only from the sea before it. Behind it lay Lake Mareotis and the routes connected to the Nile region, where the products of Egypt could be brought in, gathered, counted, and then transferred toward the harbor. There, the air carries less of the smell of sea salt, but remains damp and heavy. Smaller boats move across calmer water. People load sacks of grain, bundles of plants, textiles, papyrus, oil, wine, and goods from deep within Egypt onto the shore. If the seaport was the face Alexandria turned toward the world, then the waterways behind it were the quiet blood vessels feeding the city from within. Stand for a while near the place where goods from the interior are brought ashore. You will see that wealth does not always glitter. It can take the shape of heavy sacks of grain stacked one upon another. It can be bundles of papyrus tied carefully, waiting to be sent to places where writing, accounting, and copying are needed. It can be sealed jars, folded cloth, baskets carrying the smell of earth and river. Porters bend beneath that weight, then straighten up, take a breath, and bend again. In the account books, these goods may become numbers, but on the shoulders of laborers, they are real weight, real sweat, the real heat of midday. It was this flow of goods from the Nile that made Alexandria not only a beautiful city by the sea, but the economic center of a kingdom. Egyptian wheat could feed people and enrich the state. Papyrus could sustain the work of officials, merchants, scholars, and scribes, products of the land. Lakes, gardens, and workshops all passed through networks that the city controlled or benefited from. But in the story of everyday life, this does not need to be spoken of in grand concepts. It appears in the sound of sacks falling onto the ground, in the hand of the person recording numbers, in the watchful eye of a supervisor, in a young boy stepping aside as a line of porters passes by, and in the sound of a boat gently touching the shore behind the city. Perhaps in the late midday, you come across a group carrying goods from the inland water toward the storehouses near the harbor. They do not move quickly, but steadily, on shoulders, backs, and carts. Cargo moves like blood through a body. That body is Alexandria. Some of it goes into the market, some into state storehouses. Some waits to be loaded onto ships. Some enters workshops. Some is delivered to wealthier homes. No single rhythm within this is entirely separate. The meal in an ordinary house. The banquet in the palace. The copy in the scriptorium. The shipment at sea. The taxes of the royal court. All are connected to those sacks of goods that seem so silent. When you return to the streets, you may begin to see more of family life appearing. A door opens slightly, and inside there's the shadow of someone preparing a meal. In a small courtyard, several people talk while working with their hands. A child watches a stranger pass by, then hides behind an adult. On a roof or beside a window, cloth is drying in the sun. Someone repairs a sandal. Someone checks whether a cracked jar can still be used. In these small details, Alexandria becomes less like the center of the world and more like an actual place where human beings lived. They had small worries, repeated habits, meals history never recorded, sleep interrupted by heat, and family stories that never entered books. What makes this city special is that those ordinary lives unfolded right beside its great symbols. A bread seller could pass a royal official. A sailor might hear news of a scholarly debate he did not understand. A scholar might have to buy food from the same market as a laborer. A scribe needed ink, papyrus, lamp oil, and all of those things had to pass through the hands of people who traded, transported, and produced for that reason. There was no absolute boundary between the world of intellect and the world of daily life. They touched each other in the smallest things. Even though not everyone enjoyed the same position within the city, the afternoon begins to slow as the sun tilts slightly. The heat is still strong, but no longer as sharp as when it stood overhead. Those who have been working since early morning begin to change their pace. Some rest in the shade. Some continue because the goods are not yet finished. Some hurry to buy the last things they need before the day passes. The market does not fall silent at once, but its sound becomes less tense. Some stalls clear away goods that spoil easily. A seller counts money or the goods received in exchange. A late buyer moves more quickly through the narrow paths. Dust on the road clings to feet, hems of clothing, and cartwheels, like a thin layer of the long day settling over everything. In Alexandria, time does not flow the same way for everyone. For a scholar, a day might be measured by the passage read. For a merchant, by the goods sold. for a porter, by the number of trips made, for a healer, by the number of people who came seeking treatment, for someone keeping a household, by the meal prepared and the water brought in, for the state, by the goods recorded, the taxes calculated, and how much fuller the storehouses had become. Each measurement is true within its own world, and when placed beside one another, they reveal that the city is not merely a stage for great stories, but thousands of small rhythms passing through a single day. Perhaps the most memorable thing in this chapter is not a monument or a name. It is the feeling that Alexandria was great because it knew how to live on many levels at once. On the surface were the market, food, dust, bargaining voices, children's calls, wounds needing bandages, grain sacks needing to be moved, boats needing to dock. Deeper down was the economic network connecting the sea with the Nile, connecting small sellers with great merchants, small workshops with large storehouses, ordinary meals with royal power, and somewhere behind it all was a gentle but very clear truth. An intellectual center cannot exist if the city around it is not nourished every day. As the light begins to soften, you can look back at the streets you have just passed through. The scene is no longer as new as it was at first, but it has become more familiar. You have seen Alexandria not only through the lighthouse, the palace, or the library, but through the hands of sellers, record keepers, cart pullers, healers, bread buyers, water carriers, and those pushing boats to the lakeshore. These people may never have had their names carved into stone, but without them, the city of knowledge would have had no food, no papyrus, no lamp oil, no goods, no voices from distant regions, no rhythm of life to support the things that seemed higher. And so, before Alexandria leads us into more sacred spaces of belief and mythology, hold on to this image of daily life: a market still warm with sunlight, a healer washing his hands after bandaging a wound, a porter setting down a sack of grain and leaning back to breathe in the shade, a small boat from the waters behind the city touching gently against the shore, a child carrying a piece of hot bread through the crowd, unaware that they are living in a city later generations would call the intellectual center of the ancient world. To that child, Alexandria is simply home. But perhaps it was precisely those who called Alexandria home who made the city live, breathe, and still appear in our imagination more than 2,000 years later. As the sunlight began to lean toward the west, the streets were still crowded. The market had not yet fully quieted, and the harbor still carried the sound of cargo and voices calling to one another through the sea wind. But after a long day, the city seemed to have softened its edges. The dust on the road had warmed beneath the feet. The walls held on to the pale gold of the sun. Human shadows stretched longer across the stone. And in that gentle transition of afternoon, another rhythm of life began to appear. Not the rhythm of buying and selling, nor the rhythm of reading, copying, and debating, but the rhythm of belief. You leave the noisier neighborhoods behind and walk toward the Serapeum, the temple complex associated with Serapis, the distinctive god of Ptolemaic Alexandria. The road leading there is not merely a path through the city. It feels like a very slow shift in scene. Behind you are the sounds of bargaining, carts, the smell of food, and the heat of ordinary life. Ahead, the air grows more solemn. as though every footstep is carrying you out of a world where human beings calculate prices, and into a place where they reckon with fate, illness, death, loyalty, and hope. The Serapeum does not appear like a dream separated from stone and dust. It too is a structure raised by human hands, with steps, walls, courtyards, columns, entrances, and spaces arranged so that anyone stepping inside must feel they are approaching something larger than themselves. Yet in the afternoon light, everything around it seems to have gained another layer of breath. Incense smoke may drift thinly through the air. Voices lower. Those who come here do not move with the hurried rhythm of the market. Some bring offerings. Some bring only a prayer. Some come out of habit, out of family duty, out of obligation. Some come because inside them is a fear that no physician, no merchant, no official can fully answer. In Alexandria, the gods do not stand outside life. The gods enter life through illness, harvests, birth, death, dreams, sea voyages, fortune and misfortune, the power of the king, and the unease within each family. A sailor may pray to return safely from a journey. A mother may pray for her child's fever to pass. An old person may think of the world beyond death. A merchant may hope for smooth trade, for ships without storms, for account books without debt. And a dynasty may need the gods not only to comfort the people, but also to make its own power seem accepted by the universe. Serapis is a god born from that very need of Alexandria, in his image. There is something familiar to the Greeks, yet something also resonates from the depths of Egypt. He is not simply an old god given a new name, nor is he an entirely foreign figure dropped into the city. Serapis stands between worlds, just as Alexandria itself does. He carries a form that Greeks could recognize, with a solemn face and hair and beard, like the great gods of their own tradition. Yet behind that form are deep connections to Apis, Osiris, and to ideas of death, rebirth, fertility, and sacred power that had long lived at the heart of Egyptian religion. When you step into the temple complex, you do not need to understand all those layers of meaning at once. You only need to feel the way the space acts upon those who come here. The stone beneath your feet is cooler than the sunlit streets. The fragrance in the air makes the breath naturally slow. Light does not flood in directly, but is divided by columns and roofs into separate patches. There are corners of clear brightness, and there are deeper shadows where the eyes need a moment to adjust. That mingling of light and darkness is what makes everything feel different from the street outside. In the market, people look in order to choose goods. In the temple, people look as though waiting for a sign. You may see people arriving with small offerings. They do not have to be grand. Sometimes a humble gift is enough to reveal what someone carries inside. A little incense, a loaf of bread, a wreath of flowers, a small carved object, a silent promise. The hand that places the offering moves more slowly than when placing goods in a market. The eyes do not look around to calculate, but turn inward, even while the body stands among other people. In that moment, religion is no longer a distant system of mythology. It becomes a person hoping to be heard. On one side of the courtyard, a few people may be waiting their turn. Some whisper to the person beside them. Some remain completely silent. A man lowers his head for a long time. as though setting all his exhaustion down upon the stone floor. A woman holds tightly to the hand of the child beside her. A soldier passes by, his armor or weapon glinting faintly in the afternoon light. Yet when he enters this space, even his gait grows more subdued. The Serapeum may belong to a great system of power, may have been built by dynasty and ambition, but the people who enter it carry deeply private things. It is this meeting between the large and the small that gives the place its weight. You may hear the sounds of rituals echoing from within. The words are not always clear. Sometimes there is only the steady rhythm of recitation, the movement of feet, the sound of an object being set down, the very soft burning of incense, the whisper of fabric brushing against fabric. The sound here is different from the voices of scholars in the Mouseion. In the Mouseion, speech tries to distinguish right from wrong, one version from another, the true word from the mistaken word. In the Serapeum, speech is not necessarily meant for argument. It may be supplication, praise, repetition, a link between the living and the divine, between the present and a sacred order that human beings cannot fully hold in their hands. And then, at the center of every gaze, there is the image of Serapis. We do not need to create an overly dazzling scene to feel the power of the god statue in the imagination. It is enough to picture a solemn seated figure, a grave face, a strange combination of closeness and distance to Greeks. That image may have recalled the great gods of their own world. To Egyptians, the deeper layers of the name and its associations may have drawn the mind toward traditions far older. To the Ptolemaic court, Serapis was a bridge made of mythology, a way of saying that the Greek and Egyptian worlds could be placed beneath one sky of power. But that bridge was not simple. Building a temple did not make every difference disappear. Placing a shared god at the center did not cause every community in the city to become one naturally. Alexandria was a place of crossing, but crossings always contain friction. Greeks may have seen Serapis in one way. Egyptians may have felt another layer of meaning. The king may have needed this god as a symbol of unity. The people may have needed him as a place to send pain, illness, hope, and fear in the same statue. Many eyes saw many different things, and perhaps that is precisely why Serapis suited Alexandria so well. As the afternoon deepens, the Serapeum becomes a place where power does not need to speak too loudly. It is present in the scale of the building, in the solemnity of ritual, in the placing of the god at the heart of the city as part of a shared order. The Ptolemaic dynasty did not rule only through taxes, soldiers, and palaces. They also ruled through images, through ceremonies, through gods who could make power appear older than itself. A foreign king on Egyptian soil needed many layers of clothing. He needed to tell the Greeks that he was a worthy heir of the world of Alexander. He also needed to tell Egypt that he did not stand outside the sacred current of this land. Serapis helped create a shared language. Though that language could never completely erase distance, you can see this in the way people pass through the temple space. Some walk with a reverence that has become habit. They know where to stop, where to place their offering, when to bow their heads. Others may seem more uncertain, like newcomers to the city or to this god. They look at those around them and imitate what they see. In that gaze, there is both awe and curiosity. A great temple is not only a place where believers come to pray, it is also a place where others learn how to believe, or at least learn how to behave before what society considers sacred. In a quieter corner, there may be someone who has come because of illness. In the ancient world, the boundary between medicine, ritual, dreams, and healing was not always as clear as we often divide it today. A sick person could go to a physician, but also to a temple. They might drink medicine, but also pray to a god. They might describe their pain in words, but also search for its meaning in omens, in fate, in the anger or mercy of divine powers. This does not make them irrational in any simple sense. It shows that human beings always need more than one answer when facing their own suffering. The body needs to be treated, but the mind also needs to feel that it has not been abandoned in a world too vast. Outside the temple courtyard, the afternoon light begins to soften. The sound of the city is still distant, but filtered through walls and space. It sounds like a low current of water from time to time. A gentle wind passes through, tilting the incense smoke, stirring the edge of a waiting person's garment. In that moment, the Serapeum does not seem like a noisy place of politics. Even though politics lies deep within its stone foundation, it feels like a place where people come to stand still, still before a god, still before fear, still before questions that everyday life does not give them enough time to hear clearly. And if you look at Alexandria from the Serapeum, you can feel that this city is held together by many forms of belief. Outside the harbor, the sailor believes in the light of Pharos and in the skill of the pilot. In the market, the merchant believes in weights, measures, chance, and the ability to bargain. In the Mouseion, scholars believe in words, in argument, in the comparison of texts. In the library, the scribe believes that a carefully copied scroll can extend the life of a voice. And in the Serapeum, people believe that above or behind all those things there is still some sacred order, where the gods can see what human beings cannot. For that reason, the Serapeum is not entirely opposed to the intellectual center of Alexandria. It is another part of the same city. A city of books without gods would not be the Alexandria of the 2nd century BC. A city of commerce without ritual would not be enough to understand the ancient world. People in antiquity did not live inside the separate compartments we often arrange on paper. For them, the sea, the god, the king, illness, harvests, writing, dreams, and death could all be connected. The Serapeum is where those threads become more visible, where we see that ancient wisdom was not only about knowing much, but also about trying to live inside a universe full of unseen powers. As the sun sinks lower, the stone of the temple changes color. The steps hold the last gold of the day. The shadows of columns stretch like dark bands across the ground. Those who have come to pray begin to thin out, or perhaps only turn into a slower stream of people. A few soft voices rise and fade. One last offering is set down for the day. Someone turns back to look at the statue of the god before leaving, their gaze not clearly relieved or still anxious. Perhaps it is both. Belief rarely erases fear completely, It only helps human beings carry that fear onward without feeling entirely alone. You step out of the temple complex as the afternoon has softened. The city outside no longer resembles itself at midday. The streets are beginning to prepare for evening. Some shops pull part of their goods back inside. Passers-by look tired, but slower. Heat still lingers in the stone, but the sea wind has begun to return, a little cooler now. Behind you, the Serapeum still stands, not only as a place of worship, but as a sign of a deeper Alexandria. This city does not only want to gather goods, books, and scholars. It also wants to gather belief, or at least create a form of belief broad enough for many people to stand beneath its shadow. And perhaps that is what makes the Serapeum important in the journey of one day through Alexandria. After the harbor, we understand that the city lives by the sea. After the streets, we understand that it lives by trade and labor. After the Mouseion and the library, we understand that it lives by writing, memory, and patient readers. But when we step into the Serapeum, we understand that Alexandria also lives by sacred stories. Human beings tell themselves in order to endure the fragility of life. A god standing between Greece and Egypt. A temple standing between power and prayer. A ritual standing between politics and private pain. All of it exists together in the late afternoon light. Incense drifts across the stone courtyard. A stranger bows before the statue of Serapis. Outside, Alexandria still carries the sound of carts, cargo, distant waves, and voices calling to one another as the day fades. Inside, the last light touches the face of the god, then gradually slips down into shadow. No one in that moment can know how the future will treat this temple, this dynasty, or this city. But in the year 150 BC, as the afternoon closes, the Serapeum is still a place where human beings come to believe that the world has order, that their fears have someone to hear them, and that amid a city too vast to comprehend, the gods can still stand still, looking down, like a presence not easily named. As night began to fall over Alexandria, the city did not go dark at once. It simply changed its rhythm. The last light of the sun withdrew from the stone steps, slipped down the broad streets, faded across the rooftops, and then dissolved into the deep violet of the coastal sky. After a long day, the sounds of the market had grown thinner. The wheels were no longer so hurried. The porters moved more slowly, and doors began to close one by one. But Alexandria did not sleep like a small village after sunset. It was a harbor city, a capital, a place where power and goods never stood entirely still. Even when night came, somewhere there were still guards, record keepers, late walkers, people waiting for ships, people praying, and people reading a few more lines beneath the light of an oil lamp. From the Serapeum, if you turn back toward the roads leading to the harbor, the air is very different from midday. The heat of the day still lingers in the stone, but the sea wind has begun to soften it. The smell of dust, oil, food, smoke, and salt blends into a scent unique to a city that has lived through an entire day. On a few streets, the last sellers are putting things away. An empty basket is placed in a corner. A clay jar is carried inside. Someone calls a child home. A small laugh rises, then disappears behind a door. What seemed chaotic in daylight once night arrives, is suddenly gathered into softer pieces of memory. You walk more slowly, as though the city itself is asking people to step lightly. Stone columns stand in the darkness, no longer clear and bright as they were in the morning, but only tall, silent shapes, houses, small workshops, shops, and familiar passageways now seem to have lost some of their detail, keeping only their forms. Lamplight from a few windows falls onto the street in low golden streaks. Somewhere, a family is eating the last meal of the day. Somewhere, an old person is telling an old story. Somewhere, a newcomer to Alexandria lies awake, not yet used to the sound of the sea and the breathing of the city at night. And somewhere deeper within, in the scholarly spaces we have passed through, perhaps a scroll has still not been set down. Night in Alexandria is not only darkness, it is the hour when everything seen during the day begins to settle. In the morning, Pharos appeared like a promise from beyond the sea. At midday, the city opened itself through streets, markets, storehouses, voices, and heat in the Mouseion. We heard scholars reading, debating, doubting, and making notes in the library. We saw papyrus scrolls lying still like old breaths of the world. At the Serapeum, the incense smoke and the shadow of the divine statue reminded us that ancient people did not seek knowledge only through reason, but also sought peace of mind in the gods. Now, as night descends, all of these things are no longer separate. They become a single city, an Alexandria both real and dreamlike. Near the scholarly quarter, oil lamps may still be burning in a few rooms. Not a great light like the lighthouse out by the harbor, but a small, trembling light, just enough to illuminate a sheet of writing, a hand, a stroke of ink. A scholar bends down to finish reading the last passage. A scribe checks a copy one final time before tying it closed. A scroll is rolled slowly and carefully, as though handling it too roughly might wound the very voice inside. In the darkness thickening beyond the doorway, such work seems so small that it is almost insignificant. Yet these small lamps are the quietest image of Alexandria's wisdom. There is something deeply fragile in the sight of a person reading at night. Ink can fade, papyrus can become brittle, a lamp can be put out by the wind, the reader's eyes can tire. The reader can grow old, pass away, and leave an unfinished question for someone else. A passage may be better understood after many generations, or misunderstood in a single hurried moment. An entire work may survive if it is copied again, or disappear if no one still believes it is worth preserving. Looking at a scroll being placed into the darkness, we understand that knowledge is not like the stone of temples. It does not stand by itself. It needs hands. It needs memory. It needs people who believe that preserving a single line is as important as preserving a wall. Out there, on the sea, Pharos begins to take up its role once more. When the sun has vanished completely, the flame high above becomes clearer. By day, the lighthouse is a structure of stone. By night, it becomes the eye of the city again, to ships offshore. That light is a sign by which to find the way from the harbor shore. It is a familiar breath, repeated from one night to the next. Perhaps the wind blows more strongly on the upper levels of the tower. Perhaps the keeper must make sure the flame does not die. perhaps at the foot of the tower. Waves still strike the stone as they have done for generations. And above all, that light stands in the dark sea, not to erase the darkness entirely, but to create one certain point within the vastness. Imagine yourself returning near the harbor, where the journey began before dawn, at night. The harbor of Alexandria has another kind of beauty. The ships become dark silhouettes lying still upon the water. Their masts are thin lines cutting into the sky. The mooring ropes are stretched tight, occasionally making a soft sound when the waves shift the hulls. A few small lamps on the dock reflect upon the water, breaking into trembling streaks of light. The smell of the sea is clearer, cooler. There are fewer human voices, so every remaining sound seems deeper. The footsteps of guards, the groan of wood, the water touching stone, a distant voice drifting through the night. At this hour, Alexandria seems to be remembering itself. The city has spent the entire day moving, exchanging, debating, praying, and recording now in the darkness. Those movements retreat into the background, revealing a more secret question. How much memory can a city hold? How far can a library resist time? How long can a king protect knowledge before power changes hands? How many nights can a lighthouse guide ships before it too becomes a ruin? Then a story. Then something human beings can only imagine. The brighter Alexandria shines in memory, the deeper those questions become. In 150 BC, no one in this city can know exactly what the future will do to it. The guard outside the harbor does not know that one day. Many structures will vanish or change form. The scribe does not know which of the works he is copying will survive through many centuries, and which will disappear until only a title remains. The worshipper in the Serapeum does not know that the temple he has just left will belong to a chain of upheavals far longer than a human lifetime. The scholar inside the Mouseion does not know whether his debates will be remembered, forgotten, or survive only as a shadow in someone else's record. They live in their present, just as we live in ours, unable to see the full fragility of the things that seem solid. For that reason, Alexandria at night should not be seen as the simple ending of a glorious day. It is a place where beauty and unease sit side by side. There is beauty in the light of Pharos over the sea. There is beauty in the sound of water touching the shore. There is beauty in a scroll carefully put away. There is beauty in this multilingual, many-believing, memory-filled city as it briefly quiets beneath the sky. But there is also unease in all of it. The flame needs to be fed. Books need to be protected. Temples need believers. Power needs stability. The city needs food, water, labor, peace, and people who continue to care for it. If a single link breaks, everything that appears eternal can begin to crack. That is the fragility of ancient wisdom, not because the people of the past were less intelligent, nor because what they built was not large enough. On the contrary, they built on a vast scale, thought deeply, observed for long periods, and left traces that still astonish us. But knowledge, however great, always needs a dwelling place. It needs paper, stone, memory, language, teachers and students, scribes, readers, keepers of fire, seafarers, and those who make food for all of them. It does not exist like a distant star that needs no one to touch it. It exists like a lamp in a room, all the more precious because it can go out. As the night deepens, the harbor grows emptier. A few people sleep close to the goods they must guard. Some sailors lie on their ships, their backs accustomed to the gentle motion of the water. Inside the city, houses gradually darken. The meal is finished. The children are asleep. Adults remain awake a little longer, speaking softly about tomorrow's work, the price of goods, news from the harbor, the health of relatives, a debt, a journey, a prayer that may or may not have been heard. Alexandria is great in the eyes of history, but at night, it is also like every place where human beings live, full of small worries, private hopes, and unrecorded weariness. In some room, the last scholar may finally stand. He sets the scroll back in its place, puts out some of the lamps, and looks into the darkness for a moment before leaving. Perhaps he is thinking only of sleep. Perhaps he is still caught inside an unresolved question. Perhaps tomorrow he will open that same scroll again, read that same line again, and see something he did not see today. Knowledge often moves forward like this, not through one brilliant moment after another, but through faithful return, reading again, thinking again, comparing again, writing again, asking again. A city like Alexandria exists not only because there are many things to know, but because there are people willing to return to what they have not yet understood. Outside, Pharaoh still shines. Its flame is not like the small lamp in the reading room, but the two kinds of light secretly reflect one another. One light helps ships find the shore. One light helps the reader find meaning. One light stands on a high tower, looking out to sea. One light bends low over the surface of a page, resisting forgetfulness. Both are fragile. Both need care. And both reveal what Alexandria once wanted to become. A place that guided the way, not only guiding ships through dangerous waters, but guiding the mind through the dark sea of what human beings had not yet understood. Seen from afar, the city is now only a scattering of lights along the coast. But after passing through a day inside it, you know that each of those lights has a life behind it. A lamp in the house of a seller, a lamp beside a scribe, a lamp near a storehouse, a lamp inside a temple, a lamp belonging to a guard. Each small light preserves a part of the city, and when placed beside one another, they form Alexandria at night, no longer noisy, but still awake in its own way. No city exists only through great monuments. It exists through small lights lit every evening by people who believe that tomorrow still needs to begin. And as you stand at the harbor, watching the light of Pharaoh spread across the water, you can feel the journey of the day slowly coming to a close. Dawn brought us to Alexandria by the path of sailors. Morning opened the city of Alexander and the Ptolemaic kings. Midday showed us scholars, scribes, the library, markets, physicians, and the flow of goods from the Nile. Afternoon led us into the world of Serapis, where mythology and power met the private fears of human beings. And now, night places everything back beneath a single sky. There are no longer separate chapters. There is only one city lying between the sea and memory, Perhaps the most important thing to remember about Alexandria is not the question of what it lost. Human beings are often drawn toward loss, toward fires, ruins, and monuments that can no longer be seen. But before it was lost, Alexandria lived. It had mornings by the harbor, middays in the market, afternoons in the temple, nights beside oil lamps. It had people opening scrolls with great care. It had people carrying goods from the Nile to the sea. It had people standing silently before the statue of a god. It had people looking up at Pharos and breathing with relief because they had found their way home. Its greatness lies not only in the legend of what disappeared, but also in the countless real moments that once unfolded beneath this sky. The deeper the night becomes, the farther the city retreats into darkness. But the light of Pharos is still there, high above the sea, like the final point of a story that does not want to end. It does not promise that everything will be preserved forever. No light can promise that. It only promises that, on this night, someone is still keeping the fire. And sometimes, for human beings, that is already a great deal. A flame cannot erase the dark sea, but it can create direction. A scroll cannot save the whole past, but it can preserve one voice. A city cannot be immortal, but for a certain span of time, it can make humanity believe that understanding is worth building temples, raising towers, opening harbors, and spending an entire life pursuing. So when you leave Alexandria in your imagination, do not leave it with the sound of collapse. Leave it with the sound of night water touching stone, with the smell of sea salt in the wind, with ships lying still beneath the shadow of Pharos, with the image of a papyrus scroll being returned to a cool, dark place, waiting for tomorrow's hand to open it, with a small lamp going out in a scribe's room. Not because knowledge has died, but because the person who protects it needs sleep in order to continue in the morning. And with the distant light upon the lighthouse, still trembling, still persistent, still telling the night sea that here there once was a city that wished to gather the wisdom of the world. Alexandria at night is like this, not entirely quiet, not entirely bright, not entirely safe from time, yet in that very fragility, it becomes more intimate. We no longer see it as a cold legend in a history book, but as a place where people once stayed awake, worked, believed, doubted, grew tired, and hoped. A place that once placed light high above to guide ships, and placed light low upon paper to guide memory. A place that could not preserve everything forever, but tried. And sometimes, in the long current of history, where human beings can so easily feel small, it is that effort itself that keeps a city from disappearing completely. And now, as night has fallen over Alexandria, our journey slowly comes to a close. Beyond the harbor, the ships lie still upon the dark water. Mooring ropes tap gently against wooden hulls. The final footsteps fade across the stone, and high above, the lighthouse of Pharos still burns in the sea wind, like a memory that does not wish to go out. The city has passed through a long day, the morning of harbor and merchants, the midday of streets, storehouses, papyrus, and voices from many lands, the afternoon of the Mouseion, the library, and scholars bending over ancient scrolls, and the evening of the temple of Serapis, where knowledge, power, and belief met in the quiet fragrance of incense. Alexandria was not merely a city with a famous library. It was humanity's dream of gathering the memory of the world, a place where books, maps, medicine, poetry, mythology, and power were all held beneath the same sky. But like every flame in the night, that wisdom was more fragile than it appeared. It needed scribes, readers, protectors, questioners, and it needed later generations who would not allow it to vanish into forgetting. If tonight's story has carried you away from the present for a little while, leave a greeting in the comments below. Where are you listening from? And if you could choose the next destination in the ancient world, where would you want us to step next? Babylon, Athens, Thebes, Tenochtitlan, or a city lost beneath the sand? Do not forget to follow the fan page and subscribe to the channel so we can continue these journeys through history before sleep. And now, let the final light of Alexandria drift slowly away across the sea.